It was the summer of 1987, and Carl Winters was driving back home late one night on Route 56, a stretch of forgotten highway winding through Old Pike Hollow. He had been out with friends in the next town over, and after a few beers and laughs, the quiet ride felt like a fitting end to the evening. The dense forest on either side of the road loomed like black walls, broken only by the yellow glow of his truck's headlights. Carl was no stranger to this route. He'd driven it 100 times without so much as a second thought. But tonight, something felt off. The air in the cab of his truck was heavy, suffocating, despite the windows being cracked open. And then, in the distance, he saw a figure stumbling into the road. Carl slowed down, squinting at the pale, ragged shape. It was a man, or what was left of one. He was thin, almost skeletal, with sallow skin stretched too tight over his frame. His clothes were in tatters, filthy with mud and what Carl swore was dried blood. The man didn't move like he was drunk or lost. No, this was something else. His gait was jerky, his limbs stiff, as though they belonged to someone who'd forgotten how to walk. Carl rolled to a stop about 10 feet away, his hand hovering over the horn. But something made him hesitate. The man's head snapped up, and Carl felt his stomach drop. The eyes that met his weren't normal. They were milky and clouded, like cataracts, yet somehow they still saw. Then the man let out a sound low, guttural, and wrong. It wasn't a groan of pain or a plea for help. It was primal, almost animalistic. Carl's hand instinctively reached for the door lock. Before he could think about what to do next, the man lunged forward, slamming his hands against the hood of the truck. His mouth gapped open, revealing blackened teeth, and a smell hit Carl like a punch rot and decay, the stench of something long dead. Carl threw the truck into reverse, his tires screeching as he backed away. But the man was relentless, clawing at the hood, dragging himself toward the windshield. His fingers left streaks of something wet and dark blood. Oil? Carl didn't want to know. Panicking, Carl slammed the truck into drive and floored it. The man let out a bone-chilling wail as he tumbled off the hood and onto the asphalt. Carl didn't look back. He drove for what felt like hours, his heart pounding in his chest. When he finally reached home, he bolted the doors and windows and poured himself a drink, trying to convince himself it was just some lunatic, a junkie high on God knows what. But when he went out to his truck the next morning, the hood told a different story. There were deep scratches in the metal, and the dark streaks were still there, dried, encrusted. Worse, they smelled. Carl never took Route 56 again. And when he told his story to the locals, most of them shook their heads, muttering about the hollow and how it wasn't right to be driving through it at night. He moved out of town the following year. But sometimes when he's alone in the dark, Carl swears he can still hear that guttural sound echoing in his memory, reminding him of the night he came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. The story comes from a small farming town in Kansas, told by a man named Walter Greaves, who swore until his dying day that it was true. It was 1994, late October, when it happened. Walter was harvesting the last of his corn before the first frost. He'd been out in the field all day, the kind of bone-tired work that makes you lose track of time. By the time he was done, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows over the rows of withered stalks. Walter hopped off his tractor, wiping sweat from his brow, when he saw movement at the edge of the field. It was a man or something that looked like a man standing just where the corn met the woods. Walter called out, figuring it was one of the drifters who sometimes wandered through town. "Hey, you lost?" he shouted. The figure didn't answer, didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Even at a distance, Walter could tell something wasn't right. The man's clothes were old, tattered, like he'd been dragged through the dirt. His skin was pale, almost gray, and there was something wrong with his posture. His head hung too low, his shoulders hunched unnaturally. Walter felt a chill creep up his spine. He waved again, more forcefully this time. "You need help, or what?" That's when the figure started walking shuffling toward him. Walter could hear the dry crunch of cornstalks breaking underfoot as the man moved, dragging one leg behind him. The closer he got, the worse he looked. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken into dark hollows. And his mouth. It hung open slack, like he was trying to speak, but didn't remember how. Walter took a step back. "You all right, mister?" he asked, his voice shaking. The man didn't answer. He just kept coming, his steps uneven but relentless. And then Walter noticed something else. Eyes. They were buzzing around the man's head, landing on his face, crawling across his open mouth. The smell hit him, neck sweet and sick, like meat left to rot in the sun. Walter gagged, stumbling backward. What the hell? That's when the man lunged. It was sudden, violent. The man let out a guttural moan, his gray hands swiping at Walter, his nails blackened and jagged. Walter barely had time to react, swinging his tool, a rusty old wrench, at the man's head. The sound of the impact was wet and sickening, but the man didn't stop. Walter hit him again, harder this time, and the man crumpled to the ground. But even as he lay there, something wasn't right. His body twitched, his limbs jerking unnaturally, like a puppet with its strings cut. Walter ran. He didn't stop until he was in his house, locking every door and window. He called the sheriff, babbling about the dead man in his field. When the deputies arrived, there was no body, just a patch of flattened corn and a dark, sticky stain on the dirt. They wrote it off as Walter's imagination, maybe a trick of the light or the stress of harvest season. But Walter knew better. For weeks after, he swore he saw that same figure lurking at the edge of the field, watching him from the shadows. He started sleeping with a shotgun by his bed, but the man never came back, at least, not where anyone could see him. Walter sold the farm the following year, packed up, and moved to the city. But he told his story to anyone who would listen. He wasn't drunk, and he wasn't crazy. And every October, when the air turned cold and the fields went quiet, Walter would say the same thing. The dead don't rest out here. Not in Kansas. This story comes from a groundskeeper named Ed Hall, who worked at Penrose Cemetery in Maine back in the early 80s. Ed wasn't the type to scare easily. He'd been around death his whole life. He dug graves, laid bodies to rest, even worked double shifts during the winter when the ground was frozen solid. But there was one night he swore he'd never forget. It was late October, right around Halloween, and the nights had started getting colder. Ed was the only one on duty, making his usual rounds with a flashlight in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. Penrose wasn't a big cemetery, but it was old. The kind of place where the gravestones leaned at odd angles and moss crawled over the names like green fingers. Around midnight, Ed heard something strange, a faint shuffling sound, like footsteps dragging across the gravel path. He stopped, shined his flashlight in the direction of the noise, but there was nothing there. Just rows of headstones stretching into the dark. Probably a raccoon, he muttered to himself, though the hair on the back of his neck prickled. He kept walking, his boots crunching on the gravel. But then he heard it again, closer this time. Shuffle. Shuffle. Scrape. "Hello?" he called out. His voice sounded too loud, too hollow in the still air. "Anyone out there?" "Cemeteries closed." No answer. Ed tightened his grip on the flashlight and stepped off the path, sweeping the beam across the graves. That's when he saw it, a figure, hunched and pale, standing between two headstones about 20 feet away. "Hey, you're not supposed to be here," Ed barked, trying to sound more confident than he felt. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch. It just stood there, its head tilted to one side like it was listening. Ed took a step closer, the light catching on what he first thought was mud smeared across its face. But as he got closer, he realized it wasn't mud at all. It was something darker, something that glistened in the cold night air. Blood. "Jesus Christ," Ed whispered, stumbling back. The figure twitched, its limbs jerking awkwardly as it turned toward him. That's when Ed got a good look at its face, or what was left of it. The skin was gray and peeling, the eyes were milky white, and its mouth hung open in a silent, gaping scream. Ed dropped the thermos and bolted, running faster than he ever had in his life. But the thing was faster. He could hear it behind him, the same shuffling, scraping sound growing louder, closer. He made it to the maintenance shed and slammed the door shut, bolting it just as the thing threw itself against the wood. The whole door shook, the hinges groaning under the force. Ed grabbed a shovel and braced himself, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might explode. For what felt like hours, the thing pounded on the door, moaning low and guttural, a sound that didn't seem possible to come from anything living. Then, as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Ed stayed in that shed until sunrise, clutching the shovel like a lifeline. When he finally worked up the nerve to come out, there was no sign of the thing. But on the gravel path leading to the shed, he found footprints. Bare human footprints, if you could call them that. The toes were too long, the heels cracked and blackened, and the prints were smeared with something dark and wet. Ed quit his job that same day. He never set foot in Penrose Cemetery again, but he always warned people to stay away after dark. Sometimes he'd say, "The dead don't stay where you put him. And if they don't, you'd better pray they're not looking for company." This story came from a trucker named Ray Haskell, a guy who spent most of his life on the road. Ray wasn't one to tell tall tales, but what happened to him on a lonely stretch of highway in New Mexico still gives him nightmares. It was late around 2 a.m. when Ray's rig started acting up. He was hauling a load of scrap metal to Albuquerque, cruising along Highway 16, when the engine began to sputter. His CB radio was dead, his phone had no signal, and the nearest town was miles away. Then he saw it, a flickering neon sign in the distance. "Gas and go," it read. The place looked half abandoned. The pumps were old, the kind with spinning dials, and the station itself was little more than a shack with one dirty window. But it had lights, and Ray was desperate. He pulled in, shut off the engine, and stepped out. The air smelled wrong, like something sweet mixed with rot, but he chalked it up to a dead animal nearby. "Hello?" he called, walking toward the station. The door creaked open under his hand, and a bell jingled weakly. Inside, the place was a time capsule, dusty shelves lined with canned goods, faded cigarette ads, and an ancient cash register. But there was no one behind the counter. "Anybody here?" "I need a tow," Ray said, his voice echoing in the empty store. Then he heard a noise from the back room. A wet, slurping sound, followed by something heavy being dragged across the floor. Ray's gut told him to leave, but his curiosity got the better of him. He moved closer to the door marked "Employees Only," pushing it open just enough to peek inside. At first, he couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. There was a man, at least. He thought it was a man hunched over something on the floor. The guy's skin was pale, stretched tight over his bones, and his clothes were filthy, hanging off him in rags. Then the smell hit Ray, and he gagged. The man turned, his mouth dripping with something. Blood, Ray realized as the light from the store flickered and caught on the mess of gore spread across the floor. The man's face was wrong too. His eyes were clouded over, and his lips were pulled back in a grotesque grin. "Hey," Ray shouted, stumbling back. The man, or whatever he was, let out a low, guttural growl and started to move toward him, crawling on all fours. Ray slammed the door shut and bolted for the truck. He fumbled with his keys, glancing over his shoulder to see the thing crawling out of the station, faster than should have been possible. The engine roared to life, and Ray peeled out of the lot, gravel spraying behind him. In his mirrors, he saw the man or creature standing in the middle of the road, watching him. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side, and its mouth still dripping with whatever it had been eating. Ray didn't stop until he reached Albuquerque, and even then, he couldn't bring himself to call the cops. What would he say? That he'd seen a zombie? He never drove that stretch of Highway 16 again, but he warned every trucker he knew. "If you break down out there, you keep driving," Ray said. "Whatever's at that gas and go ain't human anymore. And it's hungry." This story comes from a woman named Laura Reed, who grew up on a small farm in Indiana during the late 1970s. Her family lived miles away from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by nothing but cornfields and silence. Laura was 16 the night it happened. Her parents had gone into town for supplies, leaving her to look after her younger brother, Sam. It was a crisp fall evening, and the two of them were sitting in the living room, Laura reading a book while Sam fiddled with a puzzle on the rug. Around p.m., the first knock came at the door. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate tap. 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 Who could that be? Laura muttered. Nobody ever came out to Carpenter's farm after dark. She got up and peeked through the peephole. A man stood on the porch, his face hidden in shadow, his shoulders hunched under a threadbare coat. He didn't move, didn't look around, just stood there with his head slightly tilted, as though he were listening for something. Laura felt a chill creep up her spine. "Can I help you?" She called through the door, trying to keep her voice steady. The man didn't answer. Instead, he raised one hand and knocked again. Tap. 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 "Laura," Sam's voice quivered from behind her. "Stay back," she whispered, locking the chain on the door. "I think you've got the wrong house," she said louder. "You need to leave," the man finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly, like he hadn't used it in years. "Please? I'm so hungry." Laura's stomach twisted. Something about the way he said it wasn't right. The words were drawn out, sluggish, like they were too heavy for his tongue. "I can call someone for you," she offered, though she didn't dare take her eyes off the door. "No," the man rasped. "I need you." Laura slammed the peephole cover shut and backed away. She grabbed Sam by the arm and pulled him toward the kitchen. "We're locking all the doors," she said, trying to sound calm. "Stay with me." The two of them moved through the house, securing every lock and window. Outside, the night was deathly quiet. No wind, no crickets, not even the distant rustle of corn stalks. Then came the scraping. It started at the front door, a slow, deliberate squelch. Squelch, like nails dragging across the wood. "He's trying to get in," Sam whispered, his face pale. "Not if we don't let him," Laura said, though her own hands were trembling. The scraping stopped, and for a moment, there was silence again. Laura was about to tell Sam to stay put when the kitchen window rattled. The man's face appeared on the other side of the glass, pale and slack, his eyes milky white, his lips pulled back in a grotesque smile. He pressed his hand against the window, and Laura saw his fingers gray and shriveled, the nails cracked and blackened. She grabbed a kitchen knife and stood between Sam and the window. "Get out of here," she screamed. The man didn't move, didn't blink. Then, with a sickening crunch, he banged his forehead against the glass. A crack spread like a spiderweb. "Run, Sam," Laura shouted, shoving her brother toward the back door. They bolted out into the night, sprinting toward the barn. Laura could hear the man behind them, his footsteps uneven and heavy, but somehow impossibly fast. They made it inside and slammed the door, throwing the latch just as the man reached it. He pounded against the wood, his growls low and guttural, like an animal. Laura grabbed a pitchfork and stood ready, her heart hammering in her chest. For hours they waited, the man circling the barn, his shadow passing by the cracks in the walls. When dawn finally came, the pounding stopped. Laura cracked the barn door open, her pitchfork raised. The man was gone, but the porch was smeared with dark, sticky handprints, and the front door was gouged deep with claw marks. Laura and Sam never saw the man again, but she swore she could still hear his voice on quiet nights, whispering from the cornfields. "Hungry." This account was shared by a man named Ray Hollis, who worked as a gravedigger in a small Maine town during the late 1990s. He claims that one autumn night, long after the funeral guests had gone home, he encountered something or someone that made him question everything he knew about life and death. Ray was no stranger to working after dark. When you dig graves for a living, you don't get to choose your hours, and some nights, the only company you have is the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. On this particular night, Ray was finishing a job for a burial scheduled early the next morning. The cemetery, Maple Hollow, was older than the town itself, with headstones so weathered you could barely read the names. He was halfway through the dig when he noticed something strange. A few rows over, near the oldest section of the cemetery, a man stood silently, staring down at one of the graves. It wasn't unusual for people to visit loved ones after hours, but there was something off about this guy. For starters, he was barefoot, despite the October chill, and his clothes a tattered suit that looked straight out of the 1940s hung off his frame, like they didn't quite fit. "Hey there," Ray called, leaning on his shovel. "Cemetery's closed, friend. You'll have to come back tomorrow." The man didn't respond. He just stood there, swaying slightly, his back to Ray. "I said," Ray started, but then the man turned around. Ray froze. Even in the dim light, he could see the man's face was all wrong. His skin was waxy, stretched tight over his skull, and his eyes were sunken, but wide open, like he'd been startled awake. His mouth hung slack, his jaw moving slightly like he was chewing on something. "Jesus," Ray muttered, gripping the shovel tighter. "You okay, buddy?" The man took a step forward. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. That's when Ray noticed the dirt. It clung to the man's hands, his clothes, even his hair, like he'd been rolling around in it. Then it hit him. The man wasn't just dirty. He was covered in grave dirt. Ray's stomach turned. What the hell? The man took another step, and this time, Ray heard it a faint wood squelch, like mud sucking at boots. Except the ground wasn't muddy. It hadn't rained in weeks. "Hey, stop right there," Ray shouted, though his voice cracked. He raised the shovel, the only weapon he had. The man ignored him, his head tilting to one side like a curious dog. He was close enough now that Ray could smell him, a sour, rotten stench that made his eyes water. "I'm warning you," Ray yelled. The man's mouth moved, but no words came out, just a low, guttural moan. Then, faster than Ray thought possible, the man lunged. Ray swung the shovel with everything he had, the blade connecting with a sickening crunch. The man staggered back, but didn't fall. Instead, he reached up, his bony fingers wrapping around the shovel's handle, yanking it out of Ray's hands like it was nothing. Panicking, Ray stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the open grave. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. Above him, the man peered down into the hole, his face blank, emotionless. For a moment, Ray thought he was done for. But then the man tilted his head again, almost thoughtful. Without a sound, he turned and shambled away, disappearing into the rows of headstones. Ray lay there, shaking, until the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon. When he finally worked up the courage to leave, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The grave the man had been standing over earlier, the dirt was disturbed, the headstone cracked in half. The name etched on the stone, John Winslow. 19011948. Ray quit his job a week later, but he never forgot that night. He says he still dreams about it sometimes, about the man's empty eyes and that awful, rotting smell. And the worst part, he swears, as the man turned to walk away, he saw something moving in the open grave. In the summer of 1986, a farmer named Eli Carter from a rural Kansas town claimed to have experienced something so terrifying that he refused to set foot in his fields again. His story spread through the small community like wildfire, and even years later, the locals still whispered about what came back from the dead. Eli was a quiet man, the kind who preferred the company of his crops to that of other people. He lived alone on his family's farm, passed down through 3 generations. That summer had been brutal, with a drought turning his once lush cornfields into brittle, crackling stalks. The trouble started one night in late August. Eli was sitting on his porch, nursing a bottle of cheap whiskey, when he noticed something strange in the distance. At first, he thought it was just the wind stirring the dry stalks, but the motion was too deliberate. It looked like something or someone was moving through the fields. Eli grabbed his shotgun and a flashlight and made his way toward the disturbance. He wasn't scared, just annoyed. Kids sometimes trespassed on his land, daring each other to run through the cornfields at night. "Hey," Eli shouted as he pushed through the rows. "You're on private property. Get the hell out of here." The rustling stopped. Eli swept his flashlight around, the beam slicing through the darkness. The corn swayed gently, but there was no wind. That's when he saw them footprints, pressed into the dry, cracked soil, barefoot and too large to belong to any kid. He swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. No crickets, no frogs, just the sound of his own breathing. "Who's there?" he called, his voice less steady now. That's when he heard it, a low, wet whisper. It didn't come from one direction, it was everywhere, surrounding him. Eli, his blood turned cold. He hadn't heard that voice in over 20 years, not since the day his younger brother, Sam, died in a tractor accident on this very farm. "Sam," Eli whispered, his throat dry. The whisper came again, louder this time, dragging through the air like nails on a chalkboard. "Eli, why'd you leave me?" Panic clawed at his chest, but he forced himself to move, following the sound. It led him deeper into the corn until he stumbled into a small clearing. And there he was. Sam. Or at least, something that looked like Sam. The figure standing before him was impossibly thin, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were milky and lifeless, yet somehow still watching him. The clothes it wore were torn and caked with dirt, Sam's Sunday best, the same suit they'd buried him in. You're dead," Eli stammered, gripping the shotgun tighter. The thing that used to be Sam tilted its head, a grotesque smile spreading across its face. "You left me, Eli. You let me rot in the ground while you stayed up here, breathing, living." Eli took a shaky step back, raising the shotgun. "You're not real. You're not Sam." The thing lunged, faster than anything that Frail had any right to move. Eli fired, the blast lighting up the clearing for a split second. The thing staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it laughed. Eli ran. He didn't stop until he was back at his house, slamming the door behind him and locking it tight. But the whispers followed. All night, they surrounded the house, scratching at the windows, pleading for him to come back to the fields. By morning, the whispers were gone, but Eli found something on his porch that made him pack up and leave the farm for good, a single muddy footprint, too large to be his own. The locals say the Carter farm has been abandoned ever since. Some claim to have heard whispers when they pass by at night, or seen figures moving in the corn. But no one's dared to go into those fields. Not after what Eli said before he left town, whatever the thing was. It wasn't my brother, and it wasn't alone. This story comes from a trucker named Dale Watson, who swears it happened during one of his overnight hauls back in 1992. Dale wasn't the kind of guy to spin tall tales. He was no nonsense, lived for his job, and spent most of his nights alone on the road. But the night he drove through the desert stretch of Route 50 in Nevada, he says, changed him forever. It was around a.m., and the road was empty, just an endless ribbon of asphalt under the moonlight. Dale liked driving at night. It was quiet, peaceful, but that peace shattered when his CB radio crackled to life. "Breaker 19. Anyone out there?" The voice was faint, distorted by static, but something about it made Dale uneasy. He grabbed the mic. "Yeah, this is Blue Ridge calling. What's up?" For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then the voice came back, clearer this time. "They're walking again. Stay off the road. Who's walking?" Dale asked, but there was no reply. Just static. He figured it was some prank, or maybe a driver messing around to keep themselves awake. He shrugged it off and kept driving. About 10 miles down the road, his headlights caught movement. A figure shuffling along the shoulder, dragging one foot like it was injured. Dale slowed down, squinting to get a better look. It was a man, or at least it had been. His clothes were filthy and torn, and his skin was pale, almost gray. But it was the way he moved that set Dale's nerves on edge. The man's head lolled to one side, his mouth slightly open as though he was mumbling something. Dale rolled down his window and leaned out. "Hey, buddy, you need help?" The figure stopped and slowly turned toward the truck. That's when Dale saw his face, or what was left of it. The man's eyes were cloudy, his cheeks sunken, and his mouth hung open in a grotesque grin, showing teeth that were blackened and broken. Dale didn't wait for an answer. He rolled up the window, hit the gas, and sped past. But as his truck roared down the highway, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man running after him. Dale swears to this day that no human could move like that. The man's body jerked and twisted unnaturally, but he was fast, keeping pace with the truck for what felt like miles. When Dale finally lost him, he pulled into the next truck stop, heart hammering in his chest. He told the attendant what he'd seen, hoping for some rational explanation. The guy just shook his head. "You're not the first to see one of them. We call them walkers out here. Folks say they're from the old mining camps, died of starvation or sickness. But they didn't stay dead. Dale laughed it off, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the light, maybe a hallucination from too much caffeine and too little sleep. But then the attendant said something that froze the blood in his veins. "You didn't stop, did you?" Dale shook his head, lying through his teeth. "Nope. Just kept driving," the guy nodded. "Good. 'Cause if you stop for them, they don't let you leave." Dale didn't sleep that night, and he avoided Route 50 for the rest of his career. But sometimes on quiet nights, when he's out on the road, he swears he can still hear the crackle of his CB radio and that faint static-filled voice warning him, "They're walking again. Stay off the road." It was late November, the kind of cold night where the wind howls down empty streets like a warning. Lisa Henderson, a single mom, was tucking her son, Timmy, into bed in their old house on the edge of town. The house was creaky, always had been. It was the kind of house you bought when you had no choice, no money, no better option. But Lisa had made it work, keeping the place warm and cozy for Timmy. She had just kissed him goodnight and was about to shut the door when she heard something. A thump. It came from downstairs. She froze for a second, then shook her head. "It's just the house settling," she muttered, trying to calm herself. The house had a way of doing that, making odd noises as if it were alive. But the thump came again, louder this time. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. She stepped into the hallway, her eyes darting around in the dim light. The sound came from the living room, and her pulse quickened. The house was old, yes, but it was locked up tight. She hadn't heard anything when she came upstairs. Nothing. Yet now, the thump. It was like someone or something was moving around down there. Slowly, she crept toward the stairs, her breath catching in her throat. She reached the top of the staircase, and that's when she saw it. A face. Not in the living room. Not behind the front door. No, this face was looking out at her from the window in the front door. It was pressed up against the glass, as if it had been there for hours, watching her. But the thing that made her blood run cold wasn't just the face, it was how still it was, how it didn't move, not even when she backed away from the stairs and her feet hit the first step. The face was pale, almost gray, with eyes that were wide open but empty. Its lips were cracked dry and pulled back into a thin, bloodless smile. Lisa stumbled back, her heart racing, her mind screaming for her to run. But she couldn't move. She couldn't look away. What happened next was a blur. She remembers grabbing her phone from the table, dialing 911, her voice trembling as she whispered into the receiver, "There's someone outside my house." "I think they're dead." The operator's voice was calm, too calm. "Stay inside, ma'am. We're sending someone out there." Lisa didn't hear the operator anymore. She was too focused on the face, still there, still staring, still smiling. The thumps from downstairs continued, each one echoing through the walls. But it wasn't until the sirens finally broke through the silence that the figure in the window moved. Slowly, like it was wading through water, it turned its head to the side and disappeared into the darkness. When the police arrived, they found nothing. No trace of anyone or anything outside. No footprints, no broken glass. Just the quiet hum of the wind and the creak of the old house. They told Lisa it was probably someone playing a prank. A trick of the light, a foggy night. But deep down, Lisa knew. She'd seen that face. She'd felt it. Whatever it was, it hadn't been human. That night, she tried to sleep, but sleep never came. And the thing that haunted her most wasn't the face at the window or the thumps downstairs. It was the feeling, the unsettling sensation that something was still there, watching, waiting. 2 weeks later, Lisa found a letter slipped under the door. It was written in a shaky, almost childlike hand. "I'm still here. I'll be waiting." Don't forget, the letter was unsigned. There was no return address. But Lisa knew deep down, she knew that whatever had looked in through her window was still out there, and it hadn't forgotten about her. And the thing about it was, neither could she. The story begins in the summer of 1986, when a man named George Walker decided to take a shortcut home from a business trip. George was a reliable, straightforward kind of guy, no superstitions, no belief in things that couldn't be explained. A good man, but a man of logic. That's how he'd always been. But on this one evening, something strange happened. It was late, past midnight. The highway was deserted, the kind of quiet where even the crickets seemed to stop chirping. George was driving through the back roads of Maine, trying to avoid the busy interstate. He didn't think much about the darkness creeping in around the edges of his headlights. It was just another night on the road. That's when he saw it, a figure standing by the side of the road, near an old crossroads. At first, George thought it was just a hitchhiker. But something about the figure didn't sit right with him. The person didn't move as he got closer. No hand raised, no sign of asking for help. The figure just stood there, motionless. He slowed down as he neared the crossroads. The figure was tall, almost unnaturally so, with hunched shoulders. It wore a long coat that dragged on the ground, and its face, well, its face was what stopped George cold. The skin was gray, pasty, like it had never seen the sun. The eyes were wide open, but they didn't blink. They just stared right through George, unblinking like a predator waiting for its prey to get too close. But what really froze him was the mouth. It was open slightly, revealing dark, cracked lips and a set of rotting teeth that didn't belong to a living human being. George could feel the hair on the back of his neck rise. But he wasn't the kind of guy to be easily spooked. He figured the guy was some drunk, maybe a vagrant who had wandered too far off the beaten path. So he rolled down his window just enough to ask if he needed help. "Hey, you okay?" George called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The figure didn't respond. Not a word. It just stared. "Hey, I asked you something," George said louder this time. Then, without warning, the figure began to move slowly, unnaturally. It wasn't like a person walking. It was more like a puppet being dragged along by invisible strings. The legs didn't bend right. The arms hung stiff at its sides. And when it began to shuffle closer to the car, that's when George noticed something even worse: the smell. A stench so foul, it burned the back of his throat. He slammed his foot on the gas, peeling away from the figure and speeding down the road, trying not to look in the rearview mirror. His pulse was racing. His hands gripped the wheel so tight, his knuckles turned white. But despite the pounding in his chest, he could still hear the faint shuffle of the thing moving behind him, like it was following. For miles, George didn't slow down. He drove and drove, never looking back, never letting up on the pedal. But as he neared the outskirts of town, the feeling that he was being watched never left. It was as if the presence of that thing had followed him, lingering just beyond his vision, just out of reach. When George finally made it home, he was shaking, his hands unsteady as he turned off the engine. The house was quiet, dark. He stumbled inside, telling his wife, who was already asleep, nothing. He figured it was just his imagination, a trick of the light, maybe too much stress from the long drive. But then, a few days later, the dreams began. They weren't ordinary dreams. They were vivid, almost real. In each one, the figure from the crossroads was there, standing just outside his window, watching. Every time George tried to scream or move, he found he couldn't. He was paralyzed, trapped in the dream, and the figure would get closer and closer until it was standing over him. It wasn't until the following week that George learned the truth. One of his coworkers at the office, Jack, a guy he barely knew, mentioned in passing that a strange man had been found dead in the woods near a crossroads just outside of town. It was a body no one could identify. The local authorities had been called, but they couldn't explain what had happened to him. The body was in a state of decay that didn't make sense for someone who had only been dead for a short time. The cause of death was a mystery. But the real kicker came when Jack mentioned that the body had been found on the very same crossroads George had passed through that night. George felt a cold wave wash over him. He knew, deep down, that the figure he had seen wasn't just some stranger. It was something else. Something dead. Something that had been waiting. But it didn't stop there. The dreams became more frequent, and one night, as George lay in bed, he could swear he heard the shuffle of footsteps outside his window. When he dared to look, there it was, standing in his yard. The same man, the same figure, just standing there, staring through the glass. Its pale face was pressed against the window now, and for the first time, George could see the ragged, torn clothing, the rotting flesh beneath the coat. It was smiling at him. The next day, George packed his bags, told his wife they were moving. He didn't care where, just somewhere far away from this place, far from that crossroads, far from whatever it was that had been following him. But he wasn't fast enough. They found his body a week later, miles from home, on a stretch of highway he never would have taken, not in a million years. And the only thing they could say for sure, his face was the same, gray, lifeless, with that same twisted smile. It's been years now, and people still say there's something out there, out by those old crossroads. Something waiting. And if you drive by late at night, when the wind picks up and the road is empty, you might see him too, the man with the smile that never dies.